Once you've created your piping, it's time to attach it to the garment. You'll want to baste it onto the layer that will ultimately be facing up under the presser foot when you go to sew the two layers of the garment together. In this case, it would be the band and the jacket. So the cording will be sandwiched between the two. If you're confused, just follow along. I'm going to cord the seam between the jacket and the band and ultimately create interrupted piping button loops, but that's for another video. Since the band is interfaced with a fusible and cut on grain, it will be the top layer when I go to attach the band to the jacket. It will sit directly under the presser foot. So it makes sense that I baste the cording to it and not the jacket. This will all make sense shortly. Since this is a busy fabric and very dark, and I'm going to be basting, I'll use a contrasting thread because anything that ultimately shows at the end can be easily removed. Normally, I'd use matching thread. We're going to start at the bottom of the band with the band right side up. We're going to lay the cording so that the seam allowances face towards the cut edge of the band. Make sure that you have the correct edge of the band because one edge is cut along the selvage of the cloth to reduce bulk and the other edge is cut. And that side has markings which will match up with the jacket. Now, I don't tend to pin things that are bias since they kind of need to feed in their own way. I want the seam that basted the cording together to sit right on the seam line of the band. The seam allowances of the cording can help to align these two elements. Trim the cording seam allowances if they're wider than 5/8 inch or 1.5 centimeters. Now, because I'm going to use this cording and band to demonstrate interrupted cording for button loops in a future video, I'm going to leave a lot extra at the bottom. You would start with the cording, even with the lower edge of the band. When you apply piping to the exterior edge of a garment, the outer perimeter, and you're going to either turn a corner at a right angle or go around a curved bottom, say like on a vest, you'll need to clip your seam allowances to allow that piping to be able to turn at a right angle or gently turn around a curve. You're going to flip the ski foot to the opposite side so that the needle is now aligned with the left edge of the foot. Start basting about 1.25 inch or 3 centimeters up from the bottom edge of the band. We will have to finish off the cording at the bottom, but I wait until the band is actually attached to the jacket to do that step. Slowly allow the bias cording to feed up the band, basting as you go until you reach the other end of the band. Again, at the other end, stop basting about 1.25 inches or 3 centimeters from the lower edge of the band. And of course, I overshot this, so I will have to cut this back. But because I basted it, no problem. Now that the cording is basted onto the band, it's time to stitch the band onto the jacket. This is another one of those situations where my mantra, now covered in the last couple of videos, is totally appropriate. And that would be pin what you know and make the rest fit. I'll begin by matching up the center back seam of the band with the center back of the jacket. In this case, I also have a seam here, so I can put those two together and pin them. And you'll notice as I'm doing this, I have no longer any visibility of the cording. The cording is now going to be sandwiched between the two layers. I'm going to go along and match and pin each of those match points together. And here's my first one. And if I look back in here, that's where it fits. And I should have one right at the shoulder. So there, and there it matches the shoulder. Okay, there's the match point, and there's the match point. There's the match point, and there's a match point. And if you did it right, the band should extend 5/8 inch below the hem. Let me just take a minute to mention, at this point I have students in my class crying out in agony, the band doesn't fit. 99% of the time it's because they didn't fold up the hem. We've covered hems in another video, so I went ahead and folded up the hem, and it is basted in place here so that the band is now going to go onto the finished lower edge of the jacket. Once all of those marks are in place, I give a tug to make the areas in between the match points fit. The band, as I've talked about, should extend 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters below the lower hemmed edge of the jacket. Trim the cording even with the lower edge of the band. It too should extend below the lower edge of the jacket. Now we'll have to open out the cording, which is why we basted it to begin with. Now we're going to clip the filler so that it is even with the lower hemmed edge of the jacket. Turn the edge of the bias in so that there is a fold in the bias at the lower edge where the jacket is hemmed. The band just extends beyond. And pin everything in place. You're going to repeat for the other end of the band. I'm not, because it will be used in next week's video. Now, this is where all of your hard work pays off. If you did this right, you should be able to follow along the basting line, stitching right on top of it through all layers to attach the band to the jacket front, securing the cording in as well, and you'll be perfectly accurate. Because I actually cut back on the basting to be able to finish off the band, I've noted where that actual seam will start. And again, I'm only going to go partway around to preserve the other side for a future video. But you just continue all the way around, starting one end with the band up under the presser foot, all the way around to the other end. Though all the seam allowances will press towards the band, there is a lot of bulk in there. I like to trim the band seam allowance only to reduce bulk. Since it is stabilized with a fusible interfacing, don't ever trim the jacket seam allowance. And you can further reduce bulk by grading the cording seam allowances. Stagger the trimmed seam allowances so that they don't all end together, creating an obvious ridge. We call that grading. And that's basically it. Now, I do want to show one more thing though. How to finish off the bottom of the band. This was a little hard to illustrate in my directions, and sometimes students get confused. So I'll show you what to do. Now, once the band seam allowance is trim, you're going to press everything away from the jacket. The band will ultimately fold around all those seams, and with the selvage edge on the back side, there won't be any additional bulk. That selvage edge would just get sewn right into the ditch from where you sewed everything together. To finish the lower edge, fold the band back on itself, right sides together at the lower edge. Basically, we're going to be stitching across this lower edge, but there's a little bit more to it. Make sure that the selvage edge from the back of the band completely lines up with the seam line where you attached the whole thing. Carefully pin the band so it's completely squared up and aligned with itself. Check again the location of the selvage. You'll be stitching across the lower edge, fairly even with where that folded hem is. But be careful that you don't stitch too close. There is a lot of bulk in here, and there needs to be room to turn. Better to have not stitched close enough. You can always stitch closer if you need to, but once you trim the bulk, you can't go back and correct if you've stitched too close. I leave about 2 to 3 millimeters distance, depending on how bulky the fabric is. And sometimes what I'll do is I'll actually weave a pin in to show me where I want to stitch along. I'm going to carefully stitch across the bottom of the jacket. Make sure to backstitch. And I'm roughly in line with the lower edge of the jacket, leaving a bit extra depth like I just described. And make sure you can see that little selvage edge peeking out, and then you know it's aligned with the ditch from the previous stitching. The zipper foot can come in really handy here when you have a lot of bulk at the bottom. Check that you like what you did. Trim away the bulk, clip off the corner, and grade the 2 seam allowances to reduce bulk. Again, grading means trimming the 2 seam allowances different widths so they don't stack on one another and create a ridge. Use a point turner to help push out the point so that it's nice and square. On the back side, all of the bulk will tuck into the band, and you'll hand stitch that selvage right to the ditch. Give the lower edge of the band a good steaming use a tailor's clapper to help flatten it. We covered that in another video. And that's it. Hopefully you'll enjoy this technique as much as I do and find all sorts of ways to use it. I'm Daryl Lancaster for The Weaver Sews.